Good afternoon and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to WLA's Summer Water Webinar Series. We'll just take a few minutes here to let people log in. We do have about 300 registrants today, so it'll take a few moments for us all to get settled here in this Zoom space. For those of you joining us today that are interested in sharing this with your network or interested in rewatching it, or if you have to leave early, don't worry, this will be recorded. And we'll be following up mid-next week with a recording of the webinar, a written recap, everything that we cover here today, we'll make sure that you have access to sometime mid-next week. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jake. I'll be the host. We'll do some introductions in a few minutes here when we get started, but just as we all get settled here, I did want to let you all know that when you registered for today's program, you did become a Western Landowners Alliance member. So welcome. It's a free membership, but we do rely on support from members like you. So please do consider providing a donation. You can learn more about our work here at WLA with the link in the chat. And you can consider making a donation and learning more about what it means to be a member using the QR code that you can see here on your screen. So again, thank you all for joining us today. We'll give it another minute or so before we get started, but we understand that it's a busy time of year and taking an hour out of your day means a great deal to us. So welcome again, and we hope you find today's programming informative, and we hope to see you as we continue on with this water webinar series throughout the summer. Okay, well, I think we've reached a pretty good critical mass here. Again, this will be recorded, so if you're tuning in late or have to hop off early, we will be able to review this sometime next week when we send that recording along. But I'd like to introduce myself, and then we can transition into our panelists here and get started with today's program. My name is Jake Lebsack, and I'm the Western Water Resources Coordinator for Western Landowners Alliance. Again, welcome to the first webinar of our new Summer Water Webinar Series. Today, we're going to be talking about flood irrigation and watershed health. This webinar does follow on the heels of our winter series, where we covered topics like process-based restoration, historical consumptive use, and understanding your water rights, irrigation efficiencies and modernization for producers, and rancher innovations for soil health. All of those recordings and recaps and more is available on our digital magazine site on land. It's also available in the link that you see there in the chat. So feel free to explore those. And hopefully you all find that informative. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our staff here at WLA. We have Linda Poole, the Working Lands Program Director, Danny Howlett, WLA's Outreach and Membership Coordinator, and Morgan Wagoner, the Colorado River Basin Stewardship Coordinator for WLA. Now I'd love to pass it over to Linda, who will provide a brief introduction to WLA and our work here. Linda, please.
Thanks, Jake. I would like to wish everybody a happy afternoon or morning, whatever time it is when you're watching this, and thank you so much for joining us today. As Jake mentioned, I'm Linda Poole. I'm the Director of the Working Lands Program of the Western Landowners Alliance. WLA is a landowner-founded and landowner-led organization that works across the West to sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. Our membership represents millions of acres of both deeded and leased public lands under management and includes a broad spectrum of land interests, ownership types, and perspectives. In fact, our membership spans the entire political spectrum, but what unites us all is a real love of the land and a desire to keep it whole and healthy for people and for wildlife. Our work at Western Landowners Alliance focuses on empowering landowners and land managers with the knowledge, the resources, and the public policies that we need to be successful through challenging times. We're pragmatic and solutions oriented in our approaches because we're landowners too and managers. We promote landowner-led, place-based collaboratives and respectful communication to improve public dialogue on complex land and natural resource management issues, working always to increase understanding of the value of private working lands to all of us and of the stewardship by landowners of all the lands that we work across. As Jake pointed out, WLA membership is free and it's available to anybody as a service to the landowner community. And membership does come with a variety of benefits to keep you up to date on news, information, resources that are available, and project opportunities. So we encourage you to spread the news and participate fully with WLA. There's so many ways to do it. And just know that WLA is here as a resource to you and to the landowner community. And want to thank you again for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. Appreciate that. Thank you all again for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about the topic of flood irrigation and watershed health. The way this is going to work is that we'll have 1 hour here with some time at the end for a brief Q&A session. If you have questions, and I sure hope you do, please use the question and answer function in Zoom. We'll reserve the chat for Morgan to share resources and for you all to provide introductions if you so feel comfortable. So please make sure to use the Q&A function for any questions, and we will get to those following the presentation. This is the first webinar of our summer water webinar series. So if you enjoyed today's programming, please consider registering for the next events in this series, where we will explore the topics of alt forage, healthy forests, and regreening. All of that information can be found in the chat, thanks to the link that Morgan just put in there. And you can find more information about other events and other programming that WLA does on our Water in the West page. So we're really excited to have about 300 folks here joining us today, or at least registered. So again, thank you. We understand it's a busy time of year, and taking time, especially on a Friday, means a lot. So again, thank you and welcome. If you are comfortable, we would love to know who you are and where you are. So please use the chat to introduce yourself. And again, please use the question and answer function for any questions you might have. Just before we get started, I do want to just provide a quick note here that by providing stories and resources and highlighting the good work of our speakers here today, we're not necessarily making a commentary on any water management practice over another. We do recognize that producers across the West have diverse needs and that certain methods are best suited for some places and not for others. We recognize that many benefits of various water management decisions, and simply the purpose of these webinars is to share information and provide an opportunity for landowners and experts to exchange knowledge. So all that being said, it's now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have Adrian Hunolt, Erica Hansen, Jim Hagenbarth, and Ginette Abdo. Adrian Hunolt, who we'll hear from first, grew up in Western Colorado and moved to Wyoming to attend the University of Wyoming. After a stint with the NRCS as a rangeland management specialist and district conservationist, he left the government to join his wife's family ranch full-time. Adrian and Jamie are now the third-generation operators of the family ranch on the Upper Bear River in southwest Wyoming. Erica Hansen has worked with the Intermountain West joint venture since 2022. As the IWJV's Water 4 coordinator, she supports the conservation of wetlands, irrigated agriculture, and water resources in ways that benefit both people and wildlife. She holds an MS in wildlife biology from Utah State University and a BS in zoology with honors from Colorado State University. After Erica, we'll hear from Jim. Jim Hagenbarth was born and raised in southwestern Montana. He received a business management degree from the University of Notre Dame, and Jim and his wife Lori have 3 grown children and live in Dillon, Montana, where together with his brother Dave and son John, Jim manages a livestock operation that began in Montana and Idaho in the late 1800s. Ginette Abdo has over 30 years of experience with the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, working on hydrogeology studies throughout Montana. She currently manages the groundwater investigation program at the Bureau, and the GWIP focuses on site-specific areas of water resource concerns, evaluating groundwater surface water interactions as it relates to irrigation efficiency, changing land use such as conversion from agricultural land to residential development, and the effects of development on stream depletion. Now it's my pleasure, and I'm excited to pass the floor over to our first speaker, Adrian Hunolt, to tell us more about what flood irrigation means to his land and his watershed. Adrian, please, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today and share a little bit about our story. Just a little bit more information on us. As you said, we are the third generation here on the ranch, and we are very proud that we are raising the fourth generation here on the ranch, but the second generation is still here as well. So that's something that we take a lot of pride in, and has been a lot of hard work for everybody. My wife and I have been up here on the ranch full time for about 18 years. So we are in extreme southwest Wyoming. We are right in the very corner of Wyoming. It's Utah on two sides of the ranch here. This area was settled by Mormon pioneers uh, in the late 1800s. And as a matter of fact, the oldest water right in Wyoming is just down the river here, just a little ways, where Mormon pioneers came back and filed for the first water right. So we're kind of up at the top of the valley. We're one of the first irrigators in the Bear River watershed as it comes down off the Uinta Mountains. And we're at about 7,800 feet here where we're irrigating. So I want to speak today mostly about why we flood irrigate. And I think that there's like three main reasons why we flood irrigate here on the ranch. And the first reason is just the soils. We are, this is like a glacial outwash here, very thin, very cobbly soils. So they're like a cobbly loam is how they're identified, but it's very thin, very low water holding capacity. So we're pretty limited by what our soils will support. We're also limited by our climate. I think if you looked on the USDA map, it would say that we're like 60 days frost free here, but most days it's more, or most years it's more like 45 days. So we'll usually have a frost about the second week of June, and then we'll have another frost sometime around in August, the second or third week of August. So we're very limited as to what we can grow up here at this elevation in this valley. And so our crops are limited basically to grass hay, and that's only on the better soils. The rest of it is just grazing. So we do have a lot of irrigated and sub-irrigated ground here in the valley that we operate. So by doing flood irrigation here, I think that it really helps us to sustain or maintain these seasonal wetlands. And so we mimic the natural process, but we modify it some. And I wanted to go into a little bit of detail about that. So it starts with the spring runoff, which comes here for us as, of course, as snow melt. And that will start around the third week of May, and it'll usually end about the third week of June or so. And so we are, basically right in the middle of that this year. That varies a little bit, as you can imagine from year to year, but that's kind of the average. So as the river starts to drop, or Mill Creek in the case of this picture here, as the natural stream flow starts to drop, we will begin to irrigate. And so that will be usually around the 1st of June. We will start diverting water from those streams, and we'll just try to keep the whole valley saturated basically for the longest amount of time that we can. So the spring runoff will start raising the water table, and then through flood irrigation, we will try to maintain that high water table because it's the only way we can grow anything. That the soil is so cobbly and so well drained that it would really dry up fast if we were not trying to maintain that. So I think that this strongly mimics what nature does, but I should also say that politically, we are strongly encouraged to do this by the state of Wyoming too. They understand that if we can fill the bank up here high in the watershed, that it will contribute to late season flow for everybody down below. And so they encourage us to start taking as much water as we can, as early as we can. And if I have time, I'd like to get into the politics of that a little bit at the end of my talk. But I think that this flood irrigation, as we all know, it somewhat mimics what beaver would have naturally done, or if these streams had a place where they could access a historic floodplain there. It's similar, but I would like to make the case that we have greatly expanded the acres that beavers ever would have flooded, or that the river would have naturally ever flooded itself. And so we keep a lot larger area wet than what normally would have been wet. And so we contribute to, I think, even more groundwater than what would have been done historically. We know that beaver store water, and that the water storage is not just in their pond per se, but there's bank loss and evaporation. I wanted to highlight one example of an issue that we have up here. You can see the red dot there on the map. That's about where the ranch is at. And that is almost the state line. The state line is just south of there. So the Bear River is a little unique here. Our water is running south to north in that photo. So above us there's about a 10-mile stretch of the West Fork of the Bear River that is absolutely covered in beaver dams. And it's on a piece of private property that cannot be accessed. Above there, we have an irrigation storage reservoir. It's not big, it only holds about 5,000 acre feet, but we rely on that for late season water. In that 10-mile stretch or so of the West Fork that's just back to back beaver dams, the state of Wyoming estimates currently that we are losing about 20% of our water. So we are charged about 20% of what we release from our reservoir up there. We cannot divert from the stream once it gets down here because they say it's gone. And so, that's partially to evaporation, but it's also a lot of bank loss with beaver dams, which is fine. It contributes to, late season flow in the stream, but it's not always ideal for us when we're trying to irrigate down here in July when water is tight. I would also say about that we are in the process of working with the state of Wyoming to try to get maybe some more accurate measurements there of how that's going, but currently a 20% loss in about a 10-mile stretch. But this flood irrigation down here in the valley creates, I believe, helps sustain or contributes to healthy habitats for a lot of different species. We've expanded that riparian area about as far as gravity will allow. As far as we can divert the water out of the streams. The people that were here before us have spread it out as far as they can. And I think that the biggest way that we contribute to wildlife habitat up here is by extending the growing season and the green in the riparian area just as long as we can into the year. And so, of course, that's for our own purposes, but it does support a lot of wildlife here in this valley. And the two bird species that I would say that I would highlight first and foremost that we see the most of around here, mostly just in abundance, is sandhill cranes. And they will actually show up here in March when there's still sometimes, like in the case of this year and last year, as much as 2 feet of snow on the ground when the sandhill cranes show up here. And they show up here by the hundreds and they nest here, hatch their hatchlings, and they leave here in our area anyway around the end of September. The other bird species that I would like to mention that seems to rely heavily on our green strips of riparian area here late in the year is sage grouse. Once the hills here start to turn brown in August and there's really not much out there, the grouse are all over the green edges of our hay meadows down here, and they will stay there until they are basically drove out by the snow and they go up to the sagebrush hills to spend the winter there. There's a lot of other migratory birds, and we're out at the edge of the Pacific Flyway here because as the bird flies, we're not very far from the Great Salt Lake. So there's also a lot of really strange birds that I don't even know the name of that come through here in the spring and don't stay long. But some of the other species that do stay all summer, like curlew, ibis, heron, a lot of geese and ducks will stay here all summer. There's other wildlife that use our green meadows down here a lot too, including elk, which in recent years, numbers have expanded and they've started staying here all through the winter, which they had not historically done, but moose all through the winter and then deer in the summer only. So we can use our irrigation and the way we manage it to try to supplement aquifer storage or groundwater storage up here in our case. So when this valley is flooded all summer, we see return flows that are extended later in the year than they would have been naturally. And downstream users benefit from that, sometimes even when it's us. We know that from the water that's released from those beaver ponds late in the year off of the West Fork. We do have some measurements on that. I see that I'm about out of time, so I'm going to wrap up with one thing that's kind of unique about the Bear River watershed here. The Bear River watershed is partially in 3 different states. And as you can see there on the map, you can still see the red dot where the ranch is. The river is flowing south to north and almost makes a big U-turn and ends up dead ending in the Great Salt Lake. It crosses 5 state lines. The Bear River watershed is the largest watershed in the Western Hemisphere that does not drain to an ocean. The Great Salt Lake is the end point for the Bear River. So all the water that runs through here just ends up evaporating in the Great Salt Lake. As you probably know, there's a big push to get more water into the Great Salt Lake. And so that's some of the pressure that is on all of us up here. But Wyoming water law dictates that every drop of water is assigned to an acre. And so I think in the case of Wyoming, these meadows up here, I think, are pretty well protected by Wyoming water law, but that is not the case necessarily in the surrounding states. And I guess that is the end of my time.
Adrian, thanks so much for sharing your story. It really is amazing to see the impact that flood irrigation can have on the land. So thanks again for joining us today. Now it's my pleasure to pass things over to our second speaker, Erica Hansen, to highlight some new flood irrigation related science and the work of her organization, IWJV. Erica, please, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Please bear with me while I share my screen really quick here. All right. Hopefully y'all can see my presentation now. Otherwise, I'm just going to be talking to myself with no good pictures. So I am Erica Hansen, and I am the Water 4 coordinator for the Intermountain West Joint Venture. I'll talk a little bit more about what the heck we are in just a moment. But today I'm going to talk about some research that we were recently engaged with that looks at the ecosystem benefits of flood irrigated grass hay, the exact systems that Adrian was talking about, and some of the very specific things that he's seen on his operation and how those translate to similar operations across the West. So before I dive in, the Intermountain West Joint Venture is a partnership that works to conserve habitat for migratory birds. And we're really looking at conserving priority bird habitats through partnership-driven, science-based projects and programs. That's our boundary, so we work across the Intermountain West. And I coordinate our Water 4 program. And we look at conserving wetlands and water for, irrigated agriculture, wildlife and fisheries habitat, groundwater recharge, and landscape resiliency in ways that matter to people. So we're really focused on finding solutions that support habitat for migratory birds, but also that support food security, support rural communities, support folks throughout the West, support healthy landscapes, because we believe that if you want to do durable conservation, you need to bring all those pieces in, and you need to find benefits or solutions that work for folks across the board in order to have durable impacts on the landscape. So why irrigated agriculture in particular? Well, it's because of exactly what you can see in this picture here. The birds, just like just about everything else in the West, follow the water. So migratory birds, as they move across the Intermountain West, it's a really arid landscape, and they rely on those patches of water as they appear across the land. And particularly in the spring, when irrigated ag is creating these wet spots, birds flock to those areas, and they really rely on them. This is something that we've known for a long time, but we have been working on science to help support that and to be able to help communicate the importance of these areas for migratory birds. So today I'm going to be talking about some new research in particular that looks at flood irrigated grass hay agriculture. So the exact systems that Adrian talked about. We started to think about, where are these places located? Does flooding mimic natural processes? How much wetland habitat do they support? Really thinking about these ecosystem services or benefits that are being provided by the irrigation practices on these lands. So before I dive into the science, this is the official scientific paper that came out. I want to recognize all the authors here. The study was led by my colleague, Patrick Donnelly at the Intermountain West Joint Venture, and his collaborators at the University of Montana and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So these are the folks that did the legwork and did the science here. And so I'm really excited to be able to share these results with you. We are going to provide some links so you can access a landing page on our website that includes this paper and a summary that we created called Intermountain Insights that highlights some of the science in a way that has, the key takeaways in a way that's nice and easier to read than a full scientific paper, as well as some mapping products, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. All right, so diving into the study itself. The study took place across the Intermountain West. So looking at these systems across the entirety of the Intermountain West area, it's that whole gray area in the map in the lower left here. And these are the types of systems we are talking about. These dots are just some examples, but the Warner Valley in Oregon, Marsh Valley in Idaho, Star Valley, Wyoming, and the San Luis Valley in Colorado. So these systems exist across the Intermountain West. And just as Adrian said, they're often linked to rivers, streams, and areas where water is diverted to flood up grass hay in the spring and produce forage for cattle as part of a ranching operation. So for the analysis, there's a bunch of fancy science that happened behind this, but ultimately what these researchers did was took a data set that had mapped irrigated lands, and then within those mapped irrigated lands, they determined which habitats in particular were flood irrigated grass hay, so a specific subset of that irrigation. They combined that with a mapped wetlands data set that we have been working on at the Intermountain West Joint Venture over the last couple of years. I'm also going to share a link to that mapped data set and some interactive maps that you can look at to see surface water across the West. But through these two data sets being combined, they were able to determine where wetlands are that are supported by flood irrigated grass hay production in particular. So we're going to be able to provide these maps as well. You can look at this flood irrigated grass hay data through our Working Wetlands Explorer and zoom around and have a look at that. So feel free to check out the links we're going to provide after this if you want to look at this in person. But really, what this mapping allows us to do is look at where these wetlands are and what they provide on the landscape at a large scale. So I'm going to talk about some of the results next. And for people that know flood irrigated grass hay, none of this is going to be surprising, I don't think. And the big take home is really, what Adrian talked about and what he sees on his land. Those things hold true across the West in general. So I'll run through a few of the key takeaways here. The first is location. So over 93% of flood irrigated grass hay wetlands occur in historic riparian floodplains. And that is important because in these riparian floodplains, these are areas where surface water and groundwater are highly interconnected. They're areas where historic flooding occurred. So these are areas that have historically been really hydrologically connected with streams and rivers. So flooding that takes place there mimics natural processes. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more in a moment with regards to timing. And I know we're going to talk about groundwater recharge in a moment, but really those things are so tied specifically to place, these riparian corridors, these wet spots in the West, and areas where flooding historically occurred. Just as Adrian mentioned, grass hay production is primarily located in upper watershed reaches, so at higher elevations than other crops, in areas where growing days are restricted, where producing grass hay makes the most sense for operations. This study reinforces that and found that this particular type of agriculture is happening at higher elevations than other types of crops. And that means that what happens in these systems impacts everything that's going on in the watershed downstream. We also found that flood irrigated grass hay has a pretty limited footprint. It represents just 3% of irrigated lands overall across the Intermountain West, but supports 58% of the temporary wetlands and 20% of the seasonal wetlands in the Intermountain West. So temporary wetlands are flooded for less than 2 months out of the year. Seasonal wetlands are flooded for between 2 and 7 months out of the year. So these wetlands that are present for a short period of time, often in the spring, aligning with that spring runoff and when areas are flooded up for hay production. And so finally, I want to talk just a little bit about timing. So we found that the timing of flooding in these systems actually aligns with natural processes. So in these graphs, we've got grass hay wetlands in green, natural wetlands are shown in the blue line. And really what I want you to take home is the peaks in these. So you can see that the peaks in the grass hay wetlands aligns with the peaks in the natural wetlands. And that's really important when we're talking about wildlife habitat, because birds need habitat to be available at a particular time when they're moving across the landscape. So the flooding in these areas is mimicking what we would see naturally. And as Adrian mentioned, we see that with how birds are using the landscape. We have recent research on sandhill cranes that tells us that flood irrigated grass hay supports 60% of the wetland breeding habitat used by cranes in the West, and up to 96% of the habitat they use during migration is on private lands. So they're really linked to private lands. Finally, we know that these systems are rare on the landscape. They occur mostly in riparian corridors, mimic natural processes, and support most of the temporary wetlands in the Intermountain West. So these irrigators are providing multiple environmental and societal benefits. So I think that's all for me. I'm probably about out of time, but appreciate you joining and look forward to the Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Erica. We're really happy you're able to join us today, and it's great to work in collaboration with IWJB. The work you all do is inspiring, and that was incredibly informative. So thanks again for being on the panel today. Just a reminder, I encourage everyone to keep an eye on the chat as Morgan continues to share resources as our presenters speak here today. And please continue to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. We are excited to address your questions following today's presentations. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jim Hagenbarth of Dillon, Montana, to share his perspectives from Montana's Big Hole and the role flood irrigation plays in supplementing groundwater and year-round flows. Jim, over to you.
Jake, thank you, and Western Landowners Alliance for allowing our producers to try to educate those folks, especially the urban people that really don't understand what we do out here in the West. We have a huge responsibility as to work with nature, and also a huge responsibility to manage the public lands. So we have two bosses. One is nature, and one is society. So, and we take this very seriously. Our family came in chasing gold in the 1870s. Well, actually in the 1860s, and then we left and went down to the valley floors and started irrigating. The Big Hole River is in southwestern Montana. It's about 180 miles long, and it has no dams. Had one dam, but it washed out. And so as you go down the river, there's choke points on that river, 3 or 4 places, and that's really, really important because it brings the groundwater back up. But if you look at the system, you start with a whole big web of tributaries. And 150 years ago, there was no irrigation. There were just wildlife and miners and a few people running around doing some trapping. And so the whole thing was just green streams, green lines on a map. They didn't have a lot of riparian areas until you got down into the bottoms, where you had some influence from early year flooding. But as we started to come into this country and started ranching and farming, and we developed all the wetlands and all those tributaries. So it makes a huge website, a huge web of riparian areas that originally weren't there. And before this was done, the mainstream down where it goes into the Jefferson probably was dry mid-August every year. And so I don't think people understand that flood irrigation has created such a tremendous number of thousands and thousands of wetland acres. It service not only the groundwater storage ability of the resource, but also enhance the wildlife and the fisheries. And so it's extremely important that people understand this, because water has huge value. And we're not going to be able, you won't even believe what the value of the water is going to be down the road. And it's going to be a huge challenge to keep the water on the land and not put it back in the river to service the huge metropolitan areas and some of the farmlands down lower where the growing season is longer and the value of water becomes greater because you can grow more cash crops. But our ranch started in about 1870. My great-grandfather moved into the Big Hole and put a toll bridge in, came out of the mines in Bannock, Montana, and developed the ranch that we're on. We have ranches in Idaho also, which is a whole different scenario. But so when you first started irrigating on these ranches and you didn't have a lot of machinery, you basically just worked with the river bottoms. And as Adrian said, the soils are not that good. So you use a sub-flood system where you try to take your ditches out on the higher part of the ground and flood and try to flood it, and then you try to dry it up, and then you try to flood it. So you have to have a kind of an infrastructure there. The soils aren't good enough to farm it or level it and go with a different form of irrigation. But as you do that on that sub-flood system, you have to use species of grasses that can handle a lot of moisture and still stay productive. What's important in the Big Hole is to get that water out in the upper part of the basin just as early as you possibly can. And that means as soon as the snow gets out of the ditches, because the more water you put out on those tributaries, it all filters down and comes down into the valley over a period of time. And it allows us to keep that river and the sloughs and the water resources along that river greener and longer. And that's huge. I belong to a group named the Big Hole Watershed Committee that was formed in 1995. As it was challenged, we were challenged by the fishing community and the urban Americans that are using our land as a recreational playground. And so we've worked with the public and tried to develop a consensus. We have developed a consensus group so everyone understands what everyone's doing, and we're starting to make some progress. We're starting to help people understand that it's important to irrigate early and cover as much ground as you possibly can and take as much water out as you possibly can, depending on your water right. So that river will stay floatable and enhance the wildlife and the fishery throughout most of the year. At times we've had real challenges. We've developed a drought plan in which the irrigators voluntarily give water when the river hits certain flows in certain sections. And then we've had developed a recreational plan, which we're trying to use to help decrease the pressure on the river. And that's huge. And because you can destroy the river with too much pressure from the recreation and have a tragedy of the commons. So also as machinery is developed, we're in a big enough valley that we can take water and put it on the areas above the floodplain. And it's unbelievable what you can see doing that. For instance, we can irrigate that and put a lot of water on it. It allows you to use other crops, but if you're going to use alfalfa, you have to really be intense in your irrigation management, otherwise you flood it out. But in managing and flooding those upper areas, you can actually see the water go down across an interstate and under a railroad track and keep areas green. They're little ways off the river, and it's unbelievable how that groundwater works. We have several stock wells, and as we irrigate, they're the lowest in March, and the highest, the level of water in the well, highest in September. And so that really is a gauge on what groundwater, how it works if you flood irrigate. In portions of the big hole drainage, some of the folks are starting to move to pivot irrigation. And actually, it was promoted as a water efficiency system. But we're finding out that when you can pump a lot of water out of the ground, but you don't put much back in using pivots. And so it has affected our ability. For instance, on our ranch, we have, there's a lot of gauges on the river because we have a drought plan, and the watershed has worked really, really hard to get all our diversions so that we can turn them on and off easily. So we know exactly what's in that river. And as the pivot irrigation increases, we're seeing places where on those gauges where, for instance, where our ranch is and our diversion is, you used to add about 50 CFS from where we divert to where it goes through the canyon down below. And now it's the other way. So as we change and as we develop our irrigation systems, we have to remember that efficiency always isn't our friend. And the wildlife in our area has increased because of the way we irrigate. But we're having a lot of trouble with the elk, as Adrian is. They're coming down there and using the winter range. And we have a lot of timber encroachment. Consequently, the elk don't have the winter feed that they used to have, so they're coming down there and living with us in the river bottoms, and that's not where they're supposed to be. But flood irrigation is huge. It's huge in the West, and it's important that we keep developing it and understanding it. And groundwater storage is probably the best way that we can store water and slow it down as it comes off the mountains. You have to remember that all these rivers and all these lakes are made up by drops of rain and flakes of snow. And how we manage those will determine how much benefit we get from each of those flakes of snow and drops of rain. But that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Jim, thank you so much for sharing your story and joining us today. You made a lot of valuable points, and I hope your words have inspired folks to ask questions that we can get to shortly. But before we do that, please welcome our final speaker here today, Ginette Abdo of the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, to close things out for us here this afternoon. Ginette, please, I'll send things over to you now.
All right, thanks, Jake, and for everybody for attending. I don't have too much more to add, but I'm going to kind of give you more of a perspective on what's going on in the subsurface. And before I start that, though, just for those who aren't familiar with the organization I work for, we're basically the State Geologic Survey. So we provide geologic and water resource information for the state of Montana, and we're non-regulatory. The program I work for, the Groundwater Investigation Program, it's stakeholder driven. The projects we work on are proposed by local entities to address local groundwater and surface water issues of concern. So overall, we evaluate groundwater surface water interactions with regards to Montana's changing land use. And understanding irrigation and irrigation return flows plays a big role, obviously, in all the western part, on how that affects our groundwater and surface water. And especially Montana irrigates over 2 million acres, and 50% of that, at least 50% of that, is flood irrigated. So we always say that in order to learn how to manage these resources, it's best to have all the information you can, and you want to quantify what you have. You need to know what you have before you could management. And so I'm gonna talk about, show you some slides of the effects of flood irrigation on groundwater in a well. And I'm also going to show you the effects of canal leakage, because I don't know, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the canals, because that's the key player in conveying the source of water to the point of use. So I'm going to start with that, keeping in mind that, and the other presenters have basically said this, but flood irrigation is one of the least efficient means of irrigation, but it has a lot of unintentional benefits. And as you have all heard today, so the water that's really lost is really not actually lost. It's actually providing a benefit to the groundwater system and to surface water. So I'm gonna take a minute here and share my screen. I just, like I said, I have a couple of graphs I wanted to show you, and just as examples of keep getting this webinar feedback form. But anyway, hopefully you can all, can you see the screen on the flood irrigation slide? Or maybe not.
Yeah, we can.
Oh, you can. Okay, let me try that again. There we go. All right. So this is a hydrograph.
We're not seeing it now, Ginette.
Oh, dang. Okay.
It was up and then it was gone.
Okay. Is it up now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this is a well located in the city limits of Bozeman, and Bozeman's an interface where we've got irrigated agriculture that's changing land use into residential development. There's a high growth area. This well, which is the red dot shown over here, is located in the middle of irrigated field, actually right next to a huge subdivision development. And the graph here on the left is a period of record of about 4 years, with representing on the X scale the time from 2010 to 2014, and groundwater elevation is on the Y scale. And so what you could see from this is basically this rise that we see, and you know, I think you all know this, year after year we see this rise. Once they start flood irrigating and just irrigating in general, we see a rise in groundwater levels. These spikes that you see are actually when the rancher applied irrigation specifically to that field. So this well that we monitor, it's only about 30 feet deep, and you could see that the levels in this well, they are pretty consistent over that 4-year period, regardless of what climate is doing. And the rise in water levels is about 10 to 12 feet. It varies depending on location, but that's a significant amount of storage in that aquifer. So just to kind of drive home the point of what the other presenters have made, but kind of looking at, well, what is that groundwater doing underneath the subsurface? And then if we move next, now we're moving back to Jim's neck of the woods, except in the upper Big Hole Basin. Jim was, Dillon's down in more of the lower part of the basin. This is a well that's located, this red dot here, about 100 feet from an irrigation canal. We've got a longer term record. We have a long-term monitoring network in Montana. This is about 25, 30 years worth of data. And every year you could see when they turn that canal on, groundwater levels rise to nearly the same height. Very indicative of a irrigation influenced hydrograph. And so if we zoom in into the years, 96 and 97, where we had continuous data, you could see that groundwater levels rise in May, and this was brought up before. It's groundwater recharge is induced by that snow melt and surface runoff. And then as that starts dissipating, groundwater levels decline. But as soon as they turn that canal on, we get this jump of over 20 to 25 feet in groundwater levels. And this happens year after year, and it remains elevated. And as soon as they turn that canal off, water levels begin to decrease. So if we didn't have that irrigation recharge, this dotted line on the bottom here represents what would happen, which is basically we wouldn't have that recharge we have coming into the system. So we irrigate, but it's an unintentional benefit. And then just to put it in a bigger picture, sorry about that. The other thing we look at in the work that we do is we develop these groundwater budgets. And a budget is essentially an accounting of all the water coming into a system or in our case, a study area and what's leaving it. And I'm not going to get into all these different components, but I wanted just to show you in our irrigated valleys, the importance of irrigation to our groundwater budget. So for instance, in the Hamilton area, which is located south of Missoula, we calculated that 20% of the recharge was due to canal leakage. And about 16% of that was irrigation return flows from that excess water applied to fields. So that's 35, a third of the budget. Similar in the Helena area, that 38% of that budget is irrigation influence. And Whitehall in the southwestern part of the state, actually a lot more irrigation was happening there. Nearly 90% of that groundwater budget inflows was attributed to irrigation water. So in Montana, at least in our irrigated valleys, it plays a pretty significant role in our groundwater budgets, and it factors into how we manage these different areas and components of the budget. So when it comes to management, some of the considerations or takeaway points that I just want to highlight, which some of them you've heard before, but for us, we need to quantify. We like to quantify the irrigation return flows and the effects it has on groundwater and surface water in order to help stakeholders best manage their resource. Jim was talking about that conversion from flood to pivot. Definitely need to consider that response if you're going to more efficient means of irrigation. We've got some thin aquifers, only 40 feet, and they rely on irrigation recharge, but yet domestic well use is obtained from those aquifers. So there's a balance there if you're decreasing that recharge. And then as that was also brought up, flood irrigation in canals can be used to intentionally manage groundwater recharge during times when you normally might not irrigate or convey water in those canals. So those are the points I wanted to just leave with. And I think that's pretty much all I have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ginette. Really appreciate everything you just shared with us. And a big thank you to our speakers today, Adrian, Erica, Jim, and Ginette. Thanks again. Excited now to save a few minutes here and answer some questions that we've received. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to address our speakers here. We're happy to field any questions that you might have. And for any questions that we don't have time to get to today, we will follow up via email. So don't be afraid that we don't have the time to get to your burning thoughts. We will. But now I'd like to start with some questions here. Adrian, you've got a question here. Does the state of Wyoming provide incentives or other support for irrigators to continue using flood irrigation?
No, they do not provide incentives. The point I was trying to make that I kind of ran out of time that is a little bit unique here is that the state owns the water in Wyoming. We do not own the water. And so they dictate what can be done with that. And so every drop of water in Wyoming is tied to a specific acre, and it has to be put to beneficial use on that acre. Whether it's pivot or flood irrigation or what, there's no incentives on our end to do anything about it. They just strongly encourage us to divert as much water as we can up at the top of the watershed as early as we can for the same reasons that Jim was talking about.
Noted. Thank you, Adrian. Jim, curious to know if that might be different in Montana. Well, as we get
yeah, you bet. Well, water rights are based on beneficial use and first in time, first in place. We're having a huge challenge on water rights, especially from the recreational community that don't understand why there's a lot of water out on the ground and a little less in the river. They don't understand it's going to come back. But yeah, it's a huge deal, and it's going to be very difficult to continue to protect our water rights down the road because of the huge demand of water. And the water commissioner is who manages your water in Idaho, where you have a good system. Montana's not done yet. The water commissioner is one step below God and family.
Sounds about right. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. Erica, switching over to you now. recognizing the importance of continued research and more data and all the work that IWJB is doing, is there any specific research that is yet to be done on the relationship between flood irrigation and habitat? I mean, are there any more plans that your organization has for any more research down the road?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. We are, we are sort of thinking about flood irrigation through the initial lens of bird habitat, of course, and we are engaged in a big west-wide study with a bunch of partners right now looking at white-faced ibis, which Adrian mentioned uses his land, and so we are looking at how those ibis use these flood irrigated lands. They're really important for their foraging. So we are going to be providing some ongoing research in support of that as well. And we are, I will say, trying to get the science out to partners so that we can, to the previous question, try and support incentives where it makes sense for landowners to stay in flood and help get them the tools that they need to sustain their operations moving forward. So we're going to continue working on developing this body of science and the information that supports it and trying to get it out to people to help share this message.
Great. Thank you so much. We're excited to see that work. Ginette, here's a question for you. How do you address the impacts on water quality caused by tailwater runoff and nutrient infiltration into the subsurface due to flood irrigation?
Actually, a lot of the work we do is more physical. It's quantity, not so much quality. I know we have issues, well, especially in the western part of the state with high saline groundwater. You know, we have looked at that along the Muscle River, but actually, to be honest, our Department of Environmental Quality addresses more of the nutrient type issues. So we are looking at it a little bit in Big Hole as far as because algal blooms are another issue that's come up in several of Montana's major rivers, and we're actually in the process of looking at some of that now in our current studies.
Great, thank you. Kind of staying in the big hole here. Here's a question for Jim. Someone loves, Jim, how you have lots of gauges on the river and a drought plan where people are cooperating to change diversions. Someone is curious to know, though, how you were able to get cooperation from ditch and landowners to put those gauges in. In this person's area, property owners are hesitant to allow any mapping of diversions and gauging on their land. So curious to know what makes your community and watershed a little different.
Well, we understand that you have to understand that the ability to measure water ensures the right that you have. If you don't measure it, you can't tell, you don't know how much you use and you can't exert your right. What's important about the gauges, it's not just the individual rights, but the whole river and how Montana is going to manage their water and protect it against downstream interests. And gauging is huge and it's important, and you should not spite yourself just because you're afraid of information, because information is going to be what wins the battles in the courts.
Appreciate that reply. Adrian, here's another question for you. Do the flood irrigators in Wyoming have experience with carbon credit contracts?
Very little that I've heard of so far. I could give a Wyoming perspective on Jim's answer there, though. In Wyoming, the state owns the water, and if they tell you to put a measuring device on it, you will either put a measuring device on it or there will be no water. So that's how we solve the problem in Wyoming.
Great, thanks. Appreciate that. Erica, here's another one for you here. Would appreciate any comments you might have about grazing management on surrounding uplands in ways that reduce bare ground over time, and in ways that hold more water in the overall landscape, and thus the riparian areas and wetlands in the bottomlands. Any thoughts you might have as to how grazing interacts with what we've talked about today?
Well, I would really look to Adrian and Jim because they're the experts on this. But I can say from our perspective at the joint venture, we really recognize that these are interconnected systems where the uplands and the lowlands are managed as one operation, and that in order for the benefits that I talked about today to exist on those lowlands, they need to be managed as part of an upland system, right? As part of a full ranching livestock operation. And so I'm not going to speak to the details of that management. And maybe Adrian and Jim, if you guys want to chime in, feel free. But from our perspective, those two pieces support each other fully. And when managed as a full system by a producer that's managing both those pieces, only through that can we see these benefits that I talked about today.
Perfect. Adrian, Jim, please feel free to have our closing words here. We've got 30 seconds.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Adrian.
You can go, Jim.
Okay, one has to realize that grazing, the disturbance of grazing, time-controlled disturbance of grazing is what is important in maintaining the grazing resource. And so cattle and wetlands work together, but you got to manage them very carefully, especially along rivers and riparian habitat. And it's all a time factor.
I would agree with that 100%. The problems occur when cattle are in one place for too long, whether it's in the riparian area or in the upland. Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for tuning in on that. And Erica for providing your thoughts as well. We do have a number of questions that we weren't able to get to today. We are at the top of the hour here, so just want to be respectful of everyone's time on this lovely Friday afternoon. So again, huge thank you to our speakers today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to staff, and a big thank you to everyone that was able to join us on the audience side. We really appreciate you joining us today. And we will be in touch shortly with a recording of today's program, a written recap, and all of the resources that were in the chat. And for those that answered or asked questions, we will be in touch with answers. We hope that you're able to join us for our next water webinar on June 28th, where we'll be discussing alternative forage and the challenges and opportunities associated with experimenting with drought resilient crops. So please register on our website. You can probably find that information in our chat too. And I'd just like to finally add one last thanks, and that goes out to the Gates Family Foundation, Conscious Bay Research, the Lohr Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, all our great partners who support our water work. So again, thank you all for joining us today. We'll be in touch, and hope you learned something. Thanks again. Take care.